Hello everyone, welcome to the September Paintalong. This is actually the third attempt to record this. It's been a crazy month. Today we are going to be doing gouache because I try to alternate like every other month or so, do watercolor, then gouache, then go back and forth because I love doing both. And I recently did a poll on Instagram or on Patreon that asked what you guys like using, and the majority of you said watercolor, but tons of you said you use watercolor but you really want to get good at gouache or get into gouache. And today I thought it would be a really good chance to show you some of the kind of quick block studies that I do. We're gonna start with a few little compositions. We'll start with two for now. These are basically gonna be exactly the same as each other. I'll put the reference photo up on screen. You can get a bigger version of this through the reference photo pack I posted a couple days ago. And if you need to, you can even trace it or you look at the screen at my line art and copy what I'm doing. But one thing I do when I look at a scene like this, which if you look up close at everything, there's so much detail and that can be pretty daunting. So we're gonna break this scene up into two sections, the background rocks and the foreground rocks. And we're gonna treat each of those sections differently when we paint as well. So first you can look at the sky and the water shape, and that will kind of help you, especially if you squint at those things, you start to see the overall shape of all of the rocks. So at first we can look at them as one big shape. But I'm going to keep my lines kind of straight and not go into too much detail. So we have one big shape. Once you do that big shape, you can start to break up different sections so you know what you're working with. So I'll leave it at that though. I'm going to keep it really simple. And then we'll do the same exact thing. Whichever strategy helps you see the overall shapes, that's fine. One thing I think that a lot of people when they're first starting with gouache can benefit from is just going for it without overthinking everything, because that's one of my biggest problems. And to be honest, lately I've been overthinking every single painting I do, and by the time I'm finished with the painting, I hate it and I don't share it because it's just, to me, it's like just the worst thing ever. How many of you have done that? Yeah, it's relatable. And then the next time I sit down to paint, I get in my head and I'm like, oh, I probably won't be able to do it again, or I won't be able to do a good job. And sometimes that will cause me to just not paint at all. So when I get into this downward spiral, I think, okay, what is the easiest way to get out of it? And that is to get the paint moving. So what I do is stuff like this, where I just break everything down to the most basic elements and I play with big shapes. I'm going to use a giant brush. You don't have to use one this big, but what I like to do is choose a brush size that's just too big for the size of painting I'm doing, where it's going to be really difficult to get any kind of detail. When this is, spreading out on the paper, it gets quite wide, and that'll make it really hard to focus on all of these little cracks and crevices and stuff in the rocks. So, just being a little bit uncomfortable with the brush size forces me to think about the big picture. And for this scene, we're going to start by blocking in our big areas of color. Over here, I have a very limited palette. So I have ultramarine, burnt sienna, kind of a yellow ochre, but it's called titanium gold ochre, permanent alizarin crimson, and cobalt turquoise light, plus white. We always need white. These are just colors left over from earlier when I was playing around. And just to start off, I'm going to mix up a big pile of juicy ultramarine. When I say juicy, I'm adding a lot of water and diluting it. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of white. And I'm just going to lay in my sky. I don't care about streaks. I don't care about evenness of color. I just care about shape. Now I'm going to add a little bit of my cobalt turquoise light, shift it just a slightly different blue, and fill in my water. By the way, this is going to soak into the paper and lose a lot of brightness. It's going to look a lot darker and a little bit more dull because it's toned paper. But this is just the start. We're gonna work our way up towards realism. Okay, so I'm gonna mix up some of my ultramarine with a tiny bit of that yellow. And then a little bit of white to desaturate it and just kind of lean it more towards a gray. And now I'm going to fill that in. Big shape. Now for the foreground, I'm going to mix my ultramarine with some of the burnt sienna. And this is going to lean more towards a dull purple. It's hard to get it to move on the dry paper, so sometimes put a brush stroke down, do it again and again until it starts to come off of the brush. And there we go. So that's it. At its most basic form, this is the landscape. And now we can move up from there. So I'm going to clean my brush off. We can learn from this first example. The sky is too dark. The water is too dark. This is too dark as well. I want to have some more grayness in this distant hill, and I want to have a bit of light on the top surface, on the top edge. This rock, I think, some areas are the right value, but we want a bit more variation for it to be realistic. So I'm going to start with my ultramarine and white. And this time add a little bit more white than I might think I need because it does soak into the paper and we lose a bit of that brightness. Once again, don't worry about streaks or anything. Just get that color on the paper. Don't overthink it. Just make sure you have enough. I mean, I try to get it as even as I can, but I know that there's going to be brush strokes showing, so just got to get over that. And now we'll do the same thing, but with the water. Same thing as before. I'm going to use the same pile of color, but mix in some of the cobalt turquoise light and a little more white. Drop that in. This is a really soft brush. I find when I'm using big, juicy brushes, I like them to be slightly stiffer because it's easier to push the paint around. With this one, it's like I have to really be careful where I'm pushing the bristles because they spread out a lot. Okay, so there we have our two first layers. And of course, it looks streaky right now because it's still drying. And different brush strokes had different amounts of water or pigment in them. So we'll give that a second to kind of soak in. But it's definitely working better than the first example already. If we want, we can touch in some cloud shapes just while it's wet. It'll be a little bit blurry. I'm gonna be very stylized with my clouds, so they're gonna be like, you know, kind of, you could even say cartoony. because that's also going to dry a lot darker. When it dries, it loses a bit of that vibrant, that bright white look. Sometimes it almost disappears completely if there's a lot of water involved. We can also lay some variation on the water. So I have some white on my brush, and as I sweep it across, it's going to blend in with that blue and then give us like a dry brush stroke. Just a little bit. And now let that dry because it might change quite a lot. You can speed this up with a hairdryer or a heat gun as well. Okay, it's getting close to being dry, and this section is still pretty distracting, so I'm just going to take a clean, damp brush and soften it. So I'm just sweeping the bristles over. Having a soft brush for this kind of thing is actually really handy. Basically, I just don't want the clouds to be too distracting, and right now they're a little bit distracting for such a small amount of space. So, okay, we'll let that dry, but we're also going to move on to the background hills. So this time, as I said, we're going to mix a similar color, but I want it to be a little more desaturated and a little bit grayer. I'm going to use my ultramarine with some white. This time I'm going to add a tiny bit of the burnt sienna, just so it's not too blue, and enough white to really lighten that up, and a little bit of that yellow ochre, because we want a tiny bit of color, but it doesn't need to be intense. And then I'm going to lay that in. So this is just fat brush strokes, no detail. Don't worry. Just do it. It doesn't have to be anywhere near perfect. It's definitely too dark. And that's why we do these studies, because we learn. So I'm going to mix a little more white and a little more yellow. The yellow ochre definitely desaturates as well. It's very earthy. I'm going to touch this lighter tone on the top edge and the left side a little bit. I'm letting it be a little bit streaky. I'm not trying to like overly blend anything. But I'm letting a little bit of that dark color peek through. The magic of a heat gun, we have a dry painting. And I can definitely see some issues with this shape back here. What I want to happen is for the gray to represent some of the highlighted sections on the rock. So I'm going to do like vertical marks of that gray. And I want some blue to be the shadows. So I'm mixing ultramarine with white. I want it to still be pretty colorful, but a little bit desaturated. And I'm going to just touch it on the right side of some of these rocks because that's where the shadow side is. Oops, getting it on my hand. Let's do some of that darker blue for the foreground again. Oh wow, I did not use enough paint because now you can see how transparent that is, right? It's like already showing the paper. Now we'll let that dry. In the distant hill, I want to add a bit of green to this top edge of the rocks. And so I'm going to use the yellow ochre and cobalt turquoise light with a little bit of white mixed in. and touch the top edge. Depending how this dries, it may be too light, maybe too dark. But most importantly, we just want to make sure it's not too saturated. I'm gonna get some white on the brush and sweep it across the water here. I want it to be more disturbed than it looked. It was too like flat, too perfect. I need some waves. The sky needs, now that I have some of the land in, I can see the sky is just not, it's not like a bright blue sky as it should be. So I'm gonna get my cobalt turquoise light and white. And I'm gonna block in the sky. No, I don't care about streaks. I don't care about any of that. It's literally just about the shape at the moment. Okay, see how that dries. You can kind of see now that that's starting to dry. Look at the difference between this first one and this one. It's like literally night and day. And to make this one on the right a little bit more believable, I'm gonna get some turquoise with the yellow and just touch the top edge of this so it looks like the light is just hitting the upper edge. Now we can have some fun with the shadows, the streaks. I'm literally just using the gray that's left over on my palette right now and maybe touch in a little bit more blue to make it a little bit deeper. And I'm letting the bristles, the hairs of the brush be all chunky and separated. And I'm just gonna sweep dry brush up. I wanna make sure it's not too light. And let it streak a lot. So these will kind of be like the vertical cracks in the rock. I'm just letting the brush do its thing. It'll kind of replicate some of that bounced light that's happening. So even though this whole side is in shadow, there's still light bouncing around on the water and reflecting back up onto the rocks, especially in the lower section. This brush is just so soft. It makes this really challenging and frustrating, but that's kind of what I need right now. It's like, I don't want to torture myself, but I kind of do. Okay, I'm gonna add a bit of purple now and then, just basically break up some of the big blue shapes. And overall it feels really dark to me. It still feels really dark. So I'm gonna take a bit of that seafoam green that I've been mixing with my cobalt turquoise light and my yellow and a bit of white mixed in, and I'm just gonna touch it on the water right here where I'm kind of picturing the light falling down into this section. I'll take some of that green that I was mixing, but it's like very diluted and kind of mixed up with all the other colors, and I'm just touching it on. And if there are any like ledges that are in the shadow side, I kind of make that up as I go a lot. Like it's not necessarily copied directly from the reference. Just if I think it will look good there, I'll do it. Okay, I'm gonna leave that one. Sorry, I just realized my memory card had been full, and all I did though was add this blue shadow. So I used pure ultramarine, and I just made a shape kind of emanating from the bottom of this cliff going right. And it's just a strong shadow shape. And that's it. And I was going to go back in and do more detail on the rocks, but once again, that is me getting trapped in the mindset of, oh, I have to make it more perfect. Oh, I have to make it more realistic. Ugh. But again, this is supposed to be just about the shapes, working on capturing the feel of the place in as few brush strokes and shapes as possible. And now that I've done those two, and wow, they are drastically different, I thought it would be fun to do a bigger one, but work a little bit quicker. And I think I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush, maybe about this size. I feel like that's a decent size for that. And I'm going to use the same ideas I did before, but I'm going to alter the colors again. Maybe because it's bigger, I'll be able to fit a little bit more detail in, but I want to start once again with the same mindset of working on those big shapes. We'll block in those bigger areas. So let's start with a sketch. My whole goal with this paint along is just to get you, if you are in the mindset of fear of messing up, or you just don't even know where to start, so you don't start at all. I totally get that. I've been there. I'm always there. And this is literally an exercise I do all the time to get me out of that mindset, because otherwise I will just sit and overthink everything out of fear of just not doing it right or not being able to do it justice. That's one thing I noticed on the trail is I'm staring at these insanely gorgeous landscapes, and I'm like, nothing I can do will ever do this justice. So why bother? But sometimes it's just about sitting there and sketching and communing with nature and enjoying the moment. It's not about saying something epic with my art, it's just enjoying it. And all of these little studies and all the little notes I take and the tiny little sketches I do along the way, they slowly add up over time. And eventually, if there is something I want to say with my art, I will have done the work already. I'll have done the skill. I'll have more of those skills that I need to say something. So that's my approach to it all. All right. Sorry, I'm trying to talk and do this at the same time. I'm taking a little more care in my shapes now. And we could even add a third dimension to this, or a third layer, and go back farther on there if we want, but still keeping it simple. Okay, so big shapes. Once again, we're learning from the previous ones we've done. I still think the sky is too dark on this one, but it's a better color. So basically using that cobalt turquoise light really helps warm or brighten it up a bit. It kind of doesn't matter what blues we use as long as we get the values right. And I like to use a different blue color in the sky just to differentiate it from whatever else is happening in the painting. So especially on a small scale like that, it really helps, I think. So this time I don't want to get carried away with like cloud shapes or anything like that, but we need more white. I'm going to start with my white this time and slowly add a bit of blue. So I can always make it darker if I need to. Just getting that top edge. And this time I'm going to just sweep it in as quickly as I can. Refill the brush as needed. When you do the first layer, a lot of times you end up with more streaks because the pigment is soaking into the paper. Once you have something on the paper, like gouache or watercolor, like you've pre-stained it or something, I find it's easier to get more even brush strokes because the paint is kind of sitting on top of itself. But we'll let this we'll let that go for now. Let that dry. And I'm going to touch a tiny bit of ultramarine in and do this distant hill back here because I want it to be like super light. So I'm just using the same mixture I had, just with more color. And that's that really distant hill and the way, way far off. It's probably actually across the firth. So we can use what we've already done as a guide, a color guide or a shape guide, whatever. And one thing I noticed when I was doing this one is I had to go back in and add these blue shadows on this distant hill. Something that happens when you're looking at a landscape is atmospheric perspective. So light bouncing around the landscape, it has to travel farther when it bounces off something far away from you. And by the time it gets to your eye, it's already passed through a lot of atmosphere. And very often, things in the far away, things in the distance appear more blue. So they have less saturation, less greens and yellows involved, less reds. And a lot of times it's even in person, the shadows or distant hills will look totally pure blue. It's pretty cool. I like to use that in my paintings. And since I love color and I love being bold, I will often emphasize that in the shadows. So using ultramarine that's only slightly diluted or grayed down just a little bit as the full shadow color or shape in those distant hills is my way of doing that. In this case, I want to start with kind of a grayed version of that, like we did before. So, oops, too much. We need more blue. So this is really dark, obviously. So I'm going to add a lot of white. Now it's very desaturated gray, and I can lean it more towards blue as I need to. That's still really dark. That would actually work in the foreground, so I'm going to just lay some of that in there. Sometimes it's also really, you could do like color notes off to the side. Okay. Now back to the hills. So blue, I'll use a tiny bit of the cobalt turquoise light and then a tiny bit of that burnt sienna and white. Maybe a little bit of yellow. Maybe even a little bit of permanent alizarin crimson to lean it more towards like a purple, but it's super subtle. And we'll try this. Lay that in. I'm just going for kind of a middle tone back here. This won't be the final color. It's just something to start with. Now that I've done the first one, this one, you know, I obviously have kind of a game plan and I can change my decisions based on what I liked or didn't like about what I did before. Also using that bigger brush for those ones, because it's really hard, it makes it, like now that I'm using a smaller brush again, I'm like, oh, this is so nice. So we can see a huge jump between these two, which is okay for now. Watercolor is going to be a little bit more colorful. So I'm going to go with my cobalt turquoise light and ultramarine and some white. Not too much this time, because I'm thinking I'll lay in some of this color and then we'll come back in with highlights and shadows on the water. And this, I really don't care if it's streaky. In fact, streakier the better, because we're going to have ripples and waves and things happening. Just filling it in. See how intense that is compared to the sky? Since there was a lot of light reflecting off of the waves in the reference photo, the reference photo makes it looks very, very bright. Like there's just a light blue across the whole section of water. But in person, there was a lot more color. It's just the camera freezes that moment, and that's what you're left with. However, it still isn't this blue. This is really intense. So I'll come back in with some more white in that same mix. And just dust it across the surface. This is a dry brush, just enough moisture to get the paint flowing. This time I'm purposefully letting all those streaks show through, letting them overlap. Mostly horizontal. And we'll leave it there for now. We can always come back and do more of that. But let's look at those middle hills now. I'm gonna now mix up my shadow color for those hills. So this is the color I used to paint that. I'm gonna just mix more blue into it, more ultramarine. So it's good to keep your mixes from before, and paint the shadow side again. So just the right side of these rocks and the kind of the base. Basically any section I want to look like there's shadow hitting it. I'm trying to force myself to work quicker, but already I can tell I'm getting like stuck on the detail, or like, ooh, I have to be careful. So if you find yourself in that mindset too, and it's stopping you from progressing, or you get into this mindset of, oh, that doesn't look right, oh no, what have I done, oh, I'm messing it up, immediately get out of that mindset. Like, that's not where we want to be. We want to be, oops, I just scraped some white into there. We don't want to be there either. The mindset we want is, I'm making decisions and I'm moving on, and then I'm making more decisions and moving on, and I'm learning a ton. And I'm not going to stop until the painting is done. I'm not going to give up, because even if in the end you don't like it, you will still learn from it. Like, having half-finished sketches in your sketchbook is not as valuable as completed ones, even if you don't like them. Okay, so I'll let that sit so it dries and I can see it, because it's glaring at the moment. And let's do the foreground. So blue with burnt sienna, a little bit of water because that's really dry, and we'll just fill that in. It's nice and dark. Running out of paint, mix some more. Won't ever get the exact same color. We're gonna paint a shadow on the water, so I'm not too worried about the base of the cliff at the moment. Just filling in the overall shapes. Now, while that dries, we can jump back to the middle section and work on those grassy cliff tops. So I'll start with some, I'll take the same color I just used on that, and I'll add in some yellow ochre. Maybe a little more blue to dull it down a little, and then touch that in. And it may not work, but we'll see. We'll let it dry, because that's the thing with gouache. The only way you can mix a color and know exactly how it's going to look on the page is if you are Gandalf. No, it can happen with time. It's a lot of time and a lot of repetition, and I mean, for me, the only way I've ever come close to that is if I use the same exact limited palette for month after month after month, and I never deviate from that palette, which can get a bit boring. So I'm gonna add a bit of cobalt into that mix so it's a little bit more vibrant with some of that yellow, because the yellow ochre mixed with ultramarine is definitely more of a dull green. And I'll touch some just on the top of that cliff. We do want this green in the background to be subdued because we're going to add some in the foreground as well. If we want, we can add a bit of white to it if it's a little bit too dark and saturated. This will give us more of like a hazy green, which works if there is a lot of mist in the air or a lot of atmosphere happening. You can kind of play with it. Now I can actually see I want to touch in a bit more ultramarine into some of the shadow sections. So just on like a few of these big rocks, these cliffs, as they plunge down into the water. I like where it's at the moment, but sometimes just like a tiny bit more variation I feel helps define it as these, because there's so many huge cracks and even caves and tunnels along these cliffs that this will give it a little bit more dimension, a little more depth. But I'm trying not to go overboard. See, this is me getting too detailed, but that's okay. I'll learn from it, you know? Okay, so stop touching it. Stop touching it. Stop touching it. Okay. Okay. Now let's move back to the foreground. We have a nice solid piece, a solid shape to work with. I'm already seeing like I want to lighten the water. Let's actually do the water, because if I do the water and then I accidentally paint over that, I'll need to redo it. So we'll start with the water. And we're gonna add some cobalt turquoise with the blue and the white. And I'm just gonna dust this. Sometimes it's helpful to just kind of dab it on a paper towel. Make sure there's not too much. I'm letting it be a little chunky near the cliff back there because there's waves that crash up onto them. And then as I get farther away from those, I will just get a little bigger with my brush strokes. It's a tricky thing. Like, if this part is frustrating you, I definitely understand. It takes a while to get the dry brush thing because it is just water control, and that's the hardest thing with gouache. So don't be too harsh with yourself if you're new to that. So I always have a paper towel. I can just go, goop, get the water off. I don't know what that sound effect was, but yeah. So just a little bit more lightness on the water I think helped. Even more could be good in this section. Because again, I picture light moving between these two big cliff sections, and then especially hitting the water here. It can be a little tricky to get that texture, so just go slow. Let's do this section because I want to get more definition on there so I can kind of see where I'm at with the whole thing. Before we added the bounced light on the shadow side of the rocks, it was like this. It was just like a big solid shape, and it was like, what is that? It's up to you to decide. It's up to you to make it work. So I'm taking the same color I already mixed, and I'm going to just add a bit of grayish blue to that. Just a little. And I'll start thinking about, if it doesn't show up, just add a tiny bit more until it starts to show up. And once again, I'm letting my brush separate, so if there's lots of chunks on that brush, not showing up yet. Let's get some more color on there. It'll help it show up. And I'm just gonna streak it on there, really. Still not showing up, so I need more. That's a little better. Very dry brush at the moment. There's like barely any paint coming off because it's so dry, which can be tricky. So I'll clean that off. Something that sometimes helps me figure out what's happening in the rocks is obviously looking at the reference, but at this point I have to sort this out. So what I'll do is I'll add some grass to the top, because most of these cliffs are lined with gorse and grasses and all sorts of growies. So I'm using cobalt turquoise light because it's going to give me a brighter green. And I'm just going to pop some of that brighter green on the top edge with very chunky marks, and even some here. And then I'm going to mix in a lot of blue, darken it, and that's going to be my shadow grass, shadow color. So I'll bring that down because there's all these little ledges on the cliff. So as soon as I start touching it, they start appearing to me, and I can just run with it. More blue because it looks too green still. So if the light is coming over the top of this cliff, the top grasses are going to be the brightest, and all the grasses in this area are going to be in shadow. So they'll be much more blue, not as prominent, but they'll still be there. You'll still be able to see them. I'm definitely exaggerating that effect more so than the reference photo, because it's fun. But I kind of go back and forth. So add a little yellow if it's too dark, or a little blue if it's not dark enough. Because we want to be able to see it. Yeah, we want it to be super subtle. Just kind of making it up. Like, I do that a lot with my rocks. Once I get the basic shape in, I just have fun designing them. And we need a bit more light on the top grasses. Really want them to look brighter compared to what's below. Let's add a bit of burnt sienna into that deep blue that we've been mixing. Maybe even a little permanent alizarin crimson. I like permanent alizarin crimson with the blue because it gives me a more purple. Don't want it to be too dark. So I'm just kind of playing with vertical streaks now. And we'll come back in and add more bounced light in a moment, but I want to really make sure I know where the majority of my big cracks are, because those kind of define the facets of rock. Still don't want to get too obsessed with detail because, again, well, we can at this point if we want, but it won't really make sense if I make like one tiny section ultra detailed and the rest is very loose. So I'm still kind of going with that feeling. All right, now I'm adding a bit of white to the same color, so it's very grayed. And I'm just gonna start glazing it on, so it's like I'm dusting it on ever so slightly. Not dark enough, or light enough, so I'm gonna add more blue and white to that mix. This probably, I don't know if this seems tedious. It's not really. Like, especially if you're not talking your way through it, if you're just doing it, it goes pretty fast. But it's a lot of like, test it, mix it again, test it, mix it again. But I find that fun. To me, it's like putting a puzzle together. Okay, just streaking on some of that lightness here and there to make some of those facets really come forth out of the shadow. But I'm not covering it completely. The streakiness just kind of makes it look more rock-like, which is great for us. Minimal effort, maximum reward. And yeah, we could keep going and do more and more of that, but at some point you just need to decide it's done. So maybe I'll just do a tiny bit more blue. Just to have some more variation. Even some pure blue will help some of those deeper cracks appear. Speaking of blue, we still need to do the shadow on the water. So I'm going to use my ultramarine, just a tiny bit of water to make sure it will move across the paper. And I'm picturing, kind of like I did here, just a big chunky shape going from the bottom of the cliff to the right, maybe about halfway over to this cliff. So all I do is chunk it on. Is that like an official paint term? Chunk it on. I'm kind of using these vertical sweeping marks here and there. And then I'm going to come back with a dry brush just like that. And whatever's left on the brush now, I'm going to sweep it to the right. So now that's going to make this section appear much brighter with the light pouring through there. I could add lemon yellow to my palette and make these grasses appear much more intense. But I did my best with what I had, the cobalt turquoise and this yellow. It can work. It's all relative. So, you know, if I made the sky a different color or this background hill's a different color, in relation to these grasses, they would appear different. So yeah, it's all relative. It doesn't always have to be like this masterpiece or this super detailed thing. You can just sit down with a single goal in mind, which is to use big shapes and help you break up the landscape. As I said, for me especially, it helps when I'm in that destructive mindset, that spiral where it's like I don't think anything I'm gonna do is gonna do the landscape justice, and so I just don't do it. I don't do anything. And it does happen a lot. Of course, as soon as I finished outlining it, I was like, okay, this is really bothering me, this one thing, and that is, it's just not quite light enough down here. So I'm gonna sweep some waves into that. So I'm just using pure white, and as that pure white dances across the paper and mixes with whatever's on there, I get some variation in color. I'm just holding my brush very lightly. What I had before could totally have worked, but it was just, I don't know. just not enough. And there's my downfall. I always think, oh, I could just do a little more. Even though this section was bright back here, I just felt like it needed a bit more oomph. And overall, it was just too big of an expanse of the same blue that to me it was distracting or felt kind of flat. I don't know. But yeah, I just wanted to come back in with a little bit. There we go. Can I live with that? Nope, let's just do a little bit more. Okay. Now we have a nice foamy sea, plenty of texture. I'm happier now. All right, for real this time. Thank you everyone. I will see you all soon. Take care.